So welcome to another edition of the Psychovertical podcast. This is a special edition called, I think I'm going to call it Higher Education. This is a midweek short little mini podcast, or a mini-sode, as my daughter would tell me. And I think I'm going to call it Higher Education. I've had lots of good ideas from social media, from people telling me what to call it, but higher education is probably a good thing to call it. Not to be confused with anything to do with real education. So higher education sort of mini podcasts are going to be basically Q&As, tips and advice about climbing and mountaineering, and hopefully be less waffly and random than the other things. So I'm sat here, I'm not actually walking for a change, I'm sat here overlooking the Persian Gulf. There's oil tankers going left and right, and anyway, that's all the randomness you're going to get. So I had a question from George on via Instagram. So he's got a cube, love the podcast, blah, 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 all that kind of sucking up stuff. Anyway, then he says, now this is going to be such a bone question that I could probably Google it. It must be American, don't know what a bone question is. But is it the most common practice to put a Prusik below the ATC, like in a few of your pictures? I always put them above the ATC when I have bothered to use them. When underneath, would you do anything to stop you? Would they do anything to stop you wrapping off the end of your ropes? Also, any chance when the book is released? So George is basically writing a book about abseiling. Basically not abseiling, but how to get down off mountains, rock faces, big walls and stuff, including walking, down climbing, abseiling, and all that kind of stuff. So I've been posting pictures on my Instagram from that book, just dripping them out there. And so the issue of Prusik loops. First of all, in the book, I actually don't call them Prusik loops. I call them like hitch cords, because I probably have to change it back to Prusik loops. So the basically idea is the thing is fundamentally, often you're not tying a Prusik loop, and sometimes it's not a loop, it's a cord. So sometimes it's a sling, blah blah blah. So I basically tried to get away from the idea of a Prusik loop, because it does seem to confuse some people. I'll explain why that is like a problem in a minute. So first of all, George, you should always use a backup. So a backup is basically using a Prusik loop as a third hand. So basically, if you let go of the rope, you're not going to die. So yes, use a Prusik loop, use a backup all the time. Use it on a single pitch, on a multi-pitch. You have to get into the habit of always using one, and you have to get into the habit of not only using one, but to also sort of bullying everybody you're climbing with who doesn't use one, because it is just it should be like standard operating procedure for climbing to use a Prusik loop. Because I was talking to a friend of mine recently who had a really bad climbing accident, abseiling accident, and he said that after he'd survived, he basically fell 40 meters and somehow bounced off lots of things and survived. He said actually after he'd come out of hospital months later with a broken back and everything else, loads of people came up to him who were like really experienced climbers and told them that they'd had like abseiling accidents or near-death accidents. So there's a great deal of like underreporting in climbing. Basically, people like to cover up the stupid shit they do. Really, I was actually thinking of doing a weekly podcast called basically called fuck ups, basically, where I tell you all the fuck ups I've done in my own climbing as a way of sort of getting other people to talk about them more often. But a lot of the accidents or near accidents I've I've heard about, I've seen, people have told me about involve kind of losing control of the ropes. So the equivalent to everyday life is basically the seatbelt. Like when the seatbelt first was introduced, everyone was like, oh God, I don't need this. I remember like people were selling t-shirts with like a black stripe across them, so people could wear a t-shirt in the car and people would think they had a seatbelt on, which is kind of ridiculous really, because a seatbelt is a really, really good thing to have. They don't work if you go off a cliff and your car's rolling down the hill, you just fly out the window. But for a front-on collision, like a seatbelt is really, really handy. So with a seatbelt, like I can remember when people didn't have seatbelts, and you didn't have to wear a seatbelt in the back of the car and things. And if you travel around, like here where I live, people don't wear seatbelts. If you get in a taxi, often there's no seatbelts in the taxi, and it's kind of scary, like hurtling down the motorway, like 70 miles an hour, and no one's got a seatbelt on, and the drivers here are pretty shocking. So not having a seatbelt is a bit like not having a Prusik loop. You want to get to the point where you've got so used to using a Prusik loop, not only do you feel very, very exposed when you have a Prusik loop on, which you are, but you also need to feel that when you see somebody else without a Prusik loop on, that they're actually doing something sort of dangerous, because it's not necessarily always about killing yourself. If you're at a crag and someone has an accident, or you have an accident, you are causing a great deal of distress, and you're causing a great deal of worry and trauma to people around you. And the mountain rescue teams and the helicopter and all this kind of stuff. So to just spend like 5 seconds putting a Prusik loop on and taking a Prusik loop off and learning how to use it properly and telling other people how to use it properly, and just being a hard ass about it, is probably the best investment in your time as a climber that you'll ever do. People hang off, or people spend like hours putting fingerboards up inside their house and never bloody using them. So invest the same amount of time in using a Prusik loop. And full disclosure, I went years and years and years and years without using a Prusik loop, and because I was from that generation where you didn't use a Prusik loop. You sometimes tied a knot in the end of the rope, and the idea was that if you lost control, then the knots were going to stop you. But if you ever see someone falling, like 60 meters is a very, very long way. Like if you lose control and you fall 60 meters, when you're bashing down the rock and probably like landing on the ground from 60 meters, you're either going to die or you're going to be smashed to pieces. So the idea that these knots on the end of a rope are there for anything other than to stop you from abseiling off the end of your rope, that's what they're for. Some people in the past used to do stuff like wrap the rope around their leg and stuff like that. But if a rock like smacks you on the head, you're generally going to end up sort of hanging upside down. The chances of that rope staying wrapped around your leg are kind of minimal, and it's just a pain in the arse really. Like just put on a Prusik. So invest in a Prusik loop and use it, and tell everybody else to use a Prusik loop. So like in the book, there's probably like about 3,000 or 4,000 words just about Prusik loops, how to use them, different knots, blah blah blah. So I'll keep it kind of simple. So the two primary, well, first of all, what Prusik loop are you going to use? Now I use a Prusik cord, which is a 70 centimeter length of 5mm cord with 70 centimeters with 2 knots tied in the end. So one knot is quite small. The bite on the knot, it's just an overhand knot. With the bite, it's quite small, and the other one's a bit larger. And the larger one allows you to feed lark's-foot the Prusik into something else. and the other one's quite small. And when you're tying it, with all Prusik loops, you need to, once you've tied them, you want to like fully weight them, get them so they're really, really solid, so they can't come undone. I have seen people where their Prusik loop actually came undone, so they were, abseiling down, just letting the rope, letting the Prusik like hold them while they were doing something, taking their hands off, and the Prusik loop actually came undone. So make sure it's like absolutely solid. So clip in something, weight it, make sure the knot's really solid. Also make sure the tails of the knot are neither too long nor too short. Like if they're too long, they'll get sucked into the Prusik knot, which will cause the Prusik to jam or maybe even fail or something. So I like to have them probably like the width of your thumb or something. So quite small, but not so small that they're going to get sucked through. And like Prusik loops tend to get better with age because they kind of soften up, but you don't want them. You don't keep them for forever. Like when they start like deteriorating a bit. And a 5mm Prusik loop, like a single strand of 5mm, is probably good to about 400 kilos. So fine for the use in this kind of thing, but I wouldn't use it for anything else. It's like if it's a Prusik loop, like a complete loop, it's probably good for like 600 kilos. So you might be able to get away with it as a thread or something, but not ideal. No, it's not ideal. And I also carry a VT Prusik, which is actually 6.8mm, like sort of Kevlar, aramid kind of super strong Prusik, which is actually very, very quite thick and super strong. And I use that for because basically if you're in a sort of a self-rescue-y sort of situation, your Prusik loop might actually get called on to hold like quite a big load. Like if it snaps, you're probably going to die. So the best example is if you have a rope that's stuck and you only have one end, the end you're at, you're going to have to sort of Prusik up the rope. And if the rope comes down, you're going to fall down onto that rope, because at the end of a rope should be attached to the belay. So you're climbing up this rope, and you can do it on your Prusik loops. And in that situation, you have to have some sort of running belay. You have to belay yourself, like you're almost like rope soloing up the rope. And you might have the rope might be clipped into you with a clove hitch, and you just keep adjusting the length of the clove hitch as you're Jumaring up this rope on your Prusik loops. But it's good to have a Prusik loop which, if you do fall, it's going to invert and hopefully just be an extra thing that's going to stop you dying. So yeah, so having one really high strength Prusik loop is a good idea, and then like a more disposable sort of 5mm. Like 5mm is a good diameter. Like I climb on like super thin ropes at the moment, just because if you're doing like adventure-y stuff and you have to carry your gear like a day or so into a route, then so I've got like Petzl, like super thin sort of Petzl ropes. It's like seven something. So then, and the other thing I have, I often carry a thing called like a rescue cord, which is like about 4 meters of 6mm cord, and that's kind of in with my like cordelettes and things. So that with the 6mm cord you can use that to set up other kind of Prusiks for like self-rescue or things. So that's your Prusik loop out of the way. So the next two points are you going to have it inline or offline? So inline is the Prusik loops attached to your harness from like the suspension point, which is going to be a belay loop, and it's like inline with your with your body. So like if it's called in to actually hold your body, it's going to hold your entire weight, and you're going to be suspended off it as if you were hanging on the rope, so you're completely safe. So offline is when you have it attached to your leg loop, and the leg loop method is very very handy. Like it's where your hand is naturally when you're abseiling, so it's very easy to push the rope down, stop it from locking up. But if it does get called on to work fully, so as in if it's not just holding your body, it's not just holding the weight of you attached to your rappel device. Say you're abseiling and the rappel device became detached from your harness, so all you were hanging on was your Prusik loop on your leg loop. Then you're basically hanging upside down by your leg loop, which is not ideal. And there was actually a case of someone who ended up hanging by the leg loop, and their leg came out of the leg loop, so they were just hanging by one leg loop, hanging there in space till they got rescued. So although it's probably the way I've abseiled the most, to just attach it to my leg loop. I have switched more over to like an inline sort of method. And in the book I've got like a number of ways of using like an inline method for various different things. But to use an inline method, a big danger is that if your Prusik loop gets sucked up into your belay device, it'll stop it from locking off. So you always have to have like a good distance between your belay device and the Prusik. So the primary, most well-known way is to use like an abseil sling or an abseil lanyard or a cow's tail, which means you extend your rappel device about 30 centimeters off from your belay loop by using a sling. So you basically lark's-foot a sling in, tie a knot in the middle, clip your device into that, so it blocks it, and then at the end you have a carabiner that you clip in and out of, and there's various ways of setting up that sling, but that's kind of the most simplest way. And your Prusik loop then attaches to your belay loop, so everything is in line, and you have a lot more control over your belay device. You can see your belay device, you're less likely to make a mistake putting it on, especially when you're wearing lots of clothes, and that is like the number one system that's worth using. So a lot of climbers, when they're climbing like single pitches, they're not going to want to do that. They don't want to get sling out because they're now abseiling down one or two pitches. So that's where like the leg loop system is kind of is good. The other way to do it is to carry, like I always carry like a 25 or 30 centimeter lock draw. Well, I carry two of them, which is just a quick draw with a locker, a really small locker on one end and a standard carabiner on the other end. And that came about from climbing in like Tuolumne, where you might only have like one or two bolts on a whole pitch. So you didn't want the rope to come undone, so I would use that for clipping the rope in. And but anyway, that's really handy for extending your belay device for abseils where you don't want to bother with a sling. So you just clip in the draw with the locker end into your quick draw, into your belay loop, and then you just clip your belay device into the other end of the draw, and just extends it out so you can have your Prusik loop in line. On the subject of lockers, I'd always use a small, really small, like DMM Metolius locker for my Prusik loops, because again, you don't want them to come unclipped, especially if you're like taking your hands off. On the subject of taking your hands off, I'm never that keen on taking my hands off. I see the rope as the Prusik is like a soft lock. It's not like a totally solid hard lock, and sometimes they have failed, so they're just there as a sort of a fail safe. But if I'm going to stop properly, I'll always tie a knot in the rope so it locks into the Prusik, or I'll wrap the rope around my leg, or I'll do something else. Sorry, some guy's going off this motorbike. So the final point is above or below. Now, the above method, you see quite a lot of people, it seems to do with, like in Australia, I've seen a lot of people with the above method, also in America, in Europe, people usually have it underneath the belay device. And The above method, the pros of it is the idea is that if you're abseiling and the ropes go through your hands, that the rope will be held by the top Prusik loop. Like in reality, because you're pushing down with your hand on the top Prusik loop to stop it from locking up. I think there's a good chance that you would just instinctively pull on the Prusik, and the rope would probably whiz through anyway. So I would never think, I won't tie knots in the end of the rope. Sometimes you don't want to tie ends of the rope anyway, knots in the end of the rope. But if it's dark, you don't know where the ropes are going, you should always tie knots in the end of the rope, or attach the ends of the rope into your harness, which is a better system. So whether that's going to work or not, it's debatable. It's like in your head, that's a good idea, but in reality it might not work, because generally you tend to you'd probably just end up pulling on the Prusik and it would probably not lock up. Also, when it's above the device, you have the entire weight of your body on the Prusik loop, where when it's below, you only have a small fraction of the weight. You only have depending how thick the rope is, the amount of weight on the Prusik is minimal when it's below the device, but above it's the entire weight. So if you make the mistake of using the wrong kind of Prusik, so this is why I don't like using the word Prusik, but I'm using it entirely the whole time. But a standard sort of classic Prusik loop, if you fully weight it above a device, you're probably going to find it's almost impossible to undo. So you're going to have to, the first time I ever used a backup when I was a kid, I was practicing, and I abseiled off an overhanging sort of cliff in Derbyshire, and halfway down I let the Prusik loop, which is above my device, lock up. Basically, it locked up completely, and I was just stuck there. I didn't have a knife or anything, and I hung there for a very, very long time. And eventually, I think I just did stood up in the rope and managed to release it, and managed to abseil down. So if you're going to use a Prusik loop above, you want to use a climb heist, or an auto block doesn't really work very well above the device. An auto block is the best not to use probably. A VT Prusik, I won't try and pronounce what it is, but a VT Prusik is probably the best not to use, but you have to learn how to use it. The only time I tend to use a Prusik above is if I'm passing a knot, because it's just easier, and then I'll tend to use a VT Prusik, because a VT Prusik you can release it even when you're fully weighting it, so you could almost abseil down on a VT Prusik without a belay device, but don't try that. Underneath, if you have an inline system, or using an abseil sling, or a lanyard or something, daisy chain, then that is by far the best method, because it will block. If you have knots tied in the rope, it will block them before they reach the device. If you have two knots stuck in your belay device with an inch, 2 inches of rope, you're pretty limited what you're going to be able to do with that. So so below inline, that is the best way to do it. And but the number one thing is, whatever way you do it, just do it, and also tell other people to do it, and say that I told you to do it. And it's as climbers, I just saw, I don't know if anybody else saw, I just saw the images of all the climbers who died this year, famous climbers, and there was a hell of a lot of famous climbers who were not on that list. And so as climbers, we have to I think we have to step up a little bit. We have to get our ass into gear, and just work out some real safe working practices, and try and tell other people to do it. If we were all skydiving, I guarantee that if people were missing out things, people would get pissed off about it and tell them about it. So that's the end of this mini-sode, and sorry there's people talking, and I hope you enjoyed it, and be safe.